March 15, 2024. Hartsfield-Jackson. Atlanta International Airport hummed with its usual afternoon chaos as thousands of travelers moved through Concourse D like a river of rolling luggage and last-minute phone calls. Gate D28 buzzed with the pre-boarding energy of passengers preparing for Continental Airways Flight 2847 to Los Angeles, a cross-country journey that promised 5 hours of cramped seats, recycled air and overpriced snacks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 12-year-old Marcus Thompson stood near the gate's floor-to-ceiling windows, watching ground crews load luggage into the belly of the Boeing 737. His worn Nike sneakers, faded jeans, and slightly oversized hoodie marked him as unremarkable in the sea of business travelers and vacation-bound families. In his backpack were 3 books about coding, a tablet his school had loaned him for the semester, and a handwritten note from his grandmother reminding him to call when he landed. What separated Marcus from the other unaccompanied minors traveling that day was the first-class ticket tucked inside his lanyard alongside his student ID. The seat had been purchased by his father, though Marcus had learned not to mention that detail too quickly. People had complicated reactions when they discovered who his father was, and Marcus had grown tired of watching their expressions shift from dismissal to calculated interest the moment they heard the name David. Thompson Catherine Walsh surveyed her gate area with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 18 years managing passenger expectations and airline protocols. At 43, she had risen to lead flight attendant on Continental's premium transcontinental routes, a position that came with additional pay, better scheduling, and the unofficial authority to make judgment calls about passenger issues before they escalated. Her navy blue uniform was impeccably pressed, her hair pulled back in the regulation bun, and her smile carried the professional warmth that passenger satisfaction surveys consistently praised. She noticed Marcus immediately, not because of anything he had done, but because of everything he represented in her mental catalogue of potential flight complications. A young black boy, traveling alone, dressed like he had raided a donation bin, holding a first-class boarding pass that surely had to be some kind of mistake. Catherine had seen this pattern before, or at least she believed she had. Tickets purchased with stolen credit cards, children sent by families gaming the unaccompanied minor system, passengers who thought a first-class ticket entitled them to behavior that disrupted everyone else's travel experience. She approached Marcus with her customer service smile firmly in place, clipboard in hand, ready to resolve what she had already decided was an error that needed correcting before it became a problem at 30,000 feet. "Excuse me, young man," Catherine said, her tone carrying the particular kind of brightness that adults use when they are about to tell children things they do not want to hear. "I need to see your boarding documents and identification." Marcus looked up from the window, his expression neutral, but guarded in the way children learn when they have been questioned about their legitimacy too many times. He pulled the lanyard from under his hoodie and handed it to her without speaking, already knowing where this conversation was heading because he had lived versions of it his entire life. Catherine examined the documents with exaggerated thoroughness, her eyebrows rising in theatrical surprise that was more performance than genuine reaction. She checked the ticket against her passenger manifest, then looked at Marcus's school ID, then back at the ticket, as if the information might change if she looked at it enough times. "This says you're seated in 2A, she announced, as if Marcus might not have been aware of his own seat assignment. "That's our premium first-class section. Are you sure this ticket is yours?" The question hung in the air with all its unspoken assumptions. Several passengers nearby stopped their own boarding preparations to watch the interaction, sensing drama in the way people always do when authority figures start questioning children in public spaces. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied quietly, his grandmother's coaching about respecting adults kicking in automatically, despite his growing discomfort. My father purchased it for me. Catherine's expression shifted into something that resembled concern, but was actually condescension wearing a helpful mask. She crouched down to Marcus's eye level, a gesture meant to appear caring, but that actually emphasized the power imbalance between them. "Honey, first-class tickets are very expensive," she said slowly, as if Marcus might not understand economics. "Sometimes people make mistakes when booking flights, or sometimes tickets get mixed up in the system. I'm sure we can find you a nice seat in the main cabin where you'll be more comfortable with the other passengers." The implication was clear to everyone watching. Catherine had decided that Marcus did not belong in first class, and she was preparing to relocate him based entirely on her assessment of his appearance and her assumptions about what kind of family could afford premium travel. She had not asked about confirmation numbers. She had not called the ticketing desk to verify the purchase. She had simply looked at a black child in worn clothing and concluded that his presence in first class represented an error that she needed to correct. Marcus felt the familiar heat rising in his chest, the anger that came from being told he did not belong in spaces he had every right to occupy. But he also heard his father's voice in his head, reminding him to stay calm, document everything, and let adults reveal who they really were before responding. His father had taught him that people's assumptions often exposed larger truths about systems and institutions, and those revelations were valuable even when they were painful. "Ma'am, my ticket is valid," Marcus said evenly, keeping his voice level despite his frustration. "My father is David Thompson. He purchased this ticket directly from Continental Airways 3 weeks ago. You can verify it in your system." The name meant nothing to Catherine, which was itself revealing. David Thompson had been featured on the cover of Forbes magazine twice in the past year. His technology company had revolutionized cloud computing infrastructure and made him one of the wealthiest entrepreneurs under 50. His face had appeared on morning news programs, tech conference stages, and philanthropic foundation boards. But Catherine had not recognized the name, and she certainly had not connected it to the boy standing in front of her. "Sweetheart, I'm sure your father is a very hard-working man," Catherine replied, her tone now dripping with the kind of patronizing sympathy that made Marcus's jaw clench. "But first-class tickets cost several $1,000s. I think there's been a misunderstanding somewhere in the booking process. Let me just make a quick call and we'll get this sorted out." She stood up and walked toward the gate desk, where her colleague Brian Patterson was processing boarding passes and making departure announcements. The conversation was loud enough that nearby passengers could hear every word, turning Marcus's humiliation into public entertainment. "Brian, we've got a situation," Catherine announced, gesturing toward Marcus with her clipboard. "That young man has a first-class boarding pass, but I think there's been some kind of error. Can you check the booking records and see if we can relocate him to economy? I want to make sure the seat is available for actual first-class passengers." Brian glanced at Marcus, then at his computer screen, his fingers moving across the keyboard as he pulled up the reservation details. What he saw there made him pause, his expression shifting from routine processing to something approaching concern. "Catherine, this ticket was purchased with a platinum corporate account," Brian said carefully, his voice low enough that only Catherine could hear. "It's paid in full, confirmed 3 weeks ago, and there's a note in the system that the passenger is traveling as an unaccompanied minor per his father's arrangements. Everything appears legitimate." Catherine was not deterred by facts that contradicted her initial assessment. She had made her judgment call, and in her mind, backing down now would undermine her authority in front of passengers and crew members who expected her to maintain order and standards. "I don't care what the computer says," Catherine insisted, her voice rising slightly. "Look at him, Brian. Does he look like someone whose family can afford first-class tickets? I've been doing this job for 18 years, and I know when something doesn't add up. That ticket was probably purchased with a stolen credit card or by someone gaming the system. I'm not having him disrupt my cabin for 5 hours because we failed to catch an obvious fraud." The accusation of fraud was delivered loudly enough that Marcus heard every word. So did the business executive standing 3 feet away. So did the family of 4 waiting to board. So did the elderly woman who had been watching the entire interaction with growing discomfort. And so did the dozen other passengers who had their phones out, recording an interaction that was rapidly becoming the kind of viral content that ended careers and cost companies millions in damaged reputation. Marcus stood perfectly still, his hands gripping his backpack straps, his face carefully neutral even as humiliation and anger warred inside him. He had been taught by his father to never let people see him lose his composure, because emotional reactions gave prejudiced people the excuse they were looking for to justify their treatment. So he waited, watching Catherine reveal exactly who she was when she thought no one important enough to matter was paying attention. What Catherine Walsh did not know, could not have known from her limited perspective and entrenched assumptions, was that her treatment of Marcus Thompson was being documented by more than just the smartphones of concerned passengers. It was being captured by airport security cameras that David Thompson's legal team would subpoena within hours. It was being recorded in the memories of witnesses who would provide detailed statements to Continental Airways corporate investigators. And most significantly, it was unfolding in real time under the observation of someone who had been watching and waiting for exactly this kind of moment to arrive. The confrontation at gate. D28 was not a random incident of everyday prejudice. It was the opening move in a much larger story about institutional accountability, parental protection, and the consequences that awaited those who mistook power for righteousness and assumption for truth. 3 days earlier, David Thompson sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor of Thompson Technologies headquarters in Silicon Valley, watching surveillance footage that made his blood run cold. The video showed his son, Marcus, walking through Chicago O'Hare International Airport 2 months prior, being stopped repeatedly by security personnel who demanded additional screening despite the boy having already passed through standard TSA procedures. 3 separate stops, 3 separate demands to empty his backpack, 3 separate assumptions that a black child traveling alone required extra scrutiny. Marcus had never mentioned the incidents to his father. David had only discovered them when his head of security, former Secret Service agent Linda Fitzgerald, flagged the footage during a routine review of family travel patterns. The company maintained sophisticated monitoring protocols for all executive family members, not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. When your net worth exceeded $12 billion and your technology secured data for half the Fortune 500, threats came from unexpected directions, but this was not a kidnapping attempt or a corporate espionage operation. This was something more insidious and far more common. This was his son, learning to shrink himself to avoid the discomfort of adults who had already decided he was suspicious based on nothing more than the color of his skin. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David had built Thompson Technologies from a dorm room startup into a global infrastructure company in less than 15 years. He had navigated hostile takeovers, patent disputes, and regulatory challenges across 4 continents. He had testified before Congress about data privacy and met with heads of state about cybersecurity frameworks. But none of that prepared him for the helpless rage of watching his child be treated like a threat simply for existing in spaces where others had decided he did not belong. The Chicago incidents were not isolated. Linda's investigation revealed a pattern stretching back 3 years across multiple airlines and airports. Flight attendants questioning whether Marcus's tickets were legitimate. Gate agents assuming he was traveling on charity programs. Security personnel giving him additional scrutiny that white children never received. Each incident was documented in airport systems, corporate databases and surveillance archives that Linda accessed through connections most people did not know existed. David had spent his entire adult life believing that wealth and success could insulate his family from the indignities he had experienced growing up in South Memphis. His mother had cleaned houses to pay for his computer science classes at community college. His father had worked double shifts at FedEx to keep their family housed and fed. They had taught him that excellence was the path to respect, that achievement would open doors that had been closed to previous generations. Now, watching footage of his son being humiliated, despite having every legitimate right to travel in comfort and dignity, David understood what his parents had tried to shield him from knowing. No amount of money changed how some people saw you. No level of achievement prevented them from making assumptions based on superficial assessments. The only thing wealth provided was the resources to document the discrimination and the power to ensure there were consequences. The decision to test the system had not been impulsive. David spent 2 weeks consulting with civil rights attorneys, corporate accountability experts, and education specialists about the most effective way to expose the pattern of discrimination his son faced. Some advised quiet settlements and confidential agreements. Others suggested media campaigns and public pressure. David chose a different path, one that would create undeniable documentation while protecting his son from becoming the face of a legal battle before he was old enough to consent to that role. The plan was methodical. Marcus would take a flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles, a route David selected specifically because Continental Airways operated it as a premium transcontinental service. The first-class ticket would be purchased using Thomson Technologies' Platinum corporate account, leaving a clear financial trail that demonstrated legitimate payment. Marcus would be dressed casually but appropriately, carrying identification and boarding documents that were beyond reproach. Every interaction would be recorded through multiple channels that David's legal team had carefully arranged to comply with applicable privacy laws. David did not tell Marcus the full scope of what was being documented. The boy knew his father took discrimination seriously and had taught him to stay calm and document incidents when they occurred. But Marcus did not know about the coordinated legal team waiting to review every moment of his journey. He did not know about the private investigators stationed throughout Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, with instructions to observe and record any questionable treatment. He did not know that his father had already filed preliminary complaints with the Department of Transportation and the Federal Aviation Administration, creating a paper trail that would force regulatory scrutiny regardless of how Continental Airways responded internally. What David was documenting was not just individual prejudice, but institutional failure. Airlines trained their personnel on anti-discrimination policies, published elaborate customer service standards, and claimed zero tolerance for bias. Yet the pattern of incidents involving Marcus demonstrated that those policies existed primarily on paper. When bias appeared in frontline interactions, it was excused as individual judgment calls or honest mistakes rather than recognized as symptoms of systematic failures in hiring. Training and accountability. The choice of Continental Airways was deliberate. The airline had recently launched a major marketing campaign celebrating diversity and inclusion, featuring advertisements with smiling families of all backgrounds enjoying premium travel experiences. Their CEO had given speeches at industry conferences about the importance of making aviation accessible and welcoming to all passengers. Their corporate social responsibility. Reports highlighted partnerships with minority-owned businesses and scholarship programs for underrepresented students pursuing aviation careers. David wanted to test whether that public commitment translated into actual treatment of passengers when no one was watching closely. Or more accurately, when airline personnel believed no one important was watching. The surveillance infrastructure he had arranged ensured that every moment of Marcus's journey was being observed by people who understood exactly what they were documenting and why it mattered. Linda Fitzgerald had coordinated with airport security officials to ensure that all relevant camera footage would be preserved and accessible for legal purposes. She had stationed investigators in the terminal with instructions to observe Marcus's interactions without interfering unless the boy's safety was genuinely threatened. She had established communication protocols with David's legal team so that any incidents could be immediately reviewed and appropriate responses prepared. The legal strategy was sophisticated. David's attorneys had prepared complaints to multiple regulatory agencies, including the Department of Transportation's Aviation Consumer Protection Division and the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. They had drafted civil lawsuits alleging violations of federal anti-discrimination statutes and breach of contract claims based on Continental Airways' failure to provide services without regard to race. They had researched the airline's history of discrimination complaints and identified patterns that suggested systematic rather than isolated failures. But more importantly, they had prepared a comprehensive public relations strategy designed to ensure that whatever happened at the airport would receive maximum exposure and generate maximum pressure for institutional change. David had personally contacted journalists at major news outlets, civil rights organizations monitoring transportation discrimination, and social media influencers who focused on racial justice issues. Everyone was positioned to receive documentation immediately if Marcus experienced the kind of treatment the pattern suggested was likely. David was not interested in quiet settlements or confidential agreements that would allow Continental Airways to pay money while admitting no wrongdoing and changing nothing about their actual practices. He wanted public accountability that would force the entire aviation industry to confront how frontline discrimination created hostile environments for passengers of color. He wanted his son's experience to create precedents that would protect other children from similar humiliation. The morning Marcus left for the airport, David had hugged him tightly and reminded him of everything they had discussed about staying calm and documenting any concerning interactions. He did not tell his son that within hours, the footage of whatever happened at Gate D28 would be in the hands of attorneys, investigators and journalists who were prepared to turn one boy's travel experience into a national conversation about institutional accountability. As David watched the real-time updates from Linda's team confirming that Marcus had checked in successfully and was approaching the departure gate, he felt the familiar combination of protective fury and calculated determination that had driven every major decision in his life. His son deserved to travel with dignity. Every child deserved that. And if it took exposing one airline's failures to begin changing an entire industry's practices, then that was exactly what David Thompson intended to do. The confrontation unfolding at Gate D28 was not a random incident that happened to be recorded. It was the deliberate result of a father who had spent 3 days preparing the ground to ensure that when discrimination occurred, as he knew it would, there would be no way for institutions to dismiss it, excuse it, or bury it the way they had buried so many previous complaints. Catherine Walsh thought she was making a routine judgment call about a passenger who did not belong in first class. What she could not have known was that her assumptions and actions were being captured, analyzed, and prepared for presentation to audiences ranging from federal regulators to social media users who would decide within hours whether she had a future in aviation or any customer-facing industry. The hidden mission was not Marcus's investigation. It was David Thompson's systematic documentation of how airlines treated his son when they believed no one powerful enough to matter was watching closely enough to care. David Thompson's journey to becoming one of the wealthiest technology entrepreneurs in America began in a place most people would consider unlikely for producing billionaires. South Memphis in the early 1980s was a landscape of economic abandonment, where factory closures had hollowed out neighborhoods and left families scrambling for stability in an increasingly unstable world. His childhood home was a 3-bedroom rental on Lauderdale Street, where 7 people shared space designed for half that number. His mother, Gloria Thompson, worked as a domestic cleaner for wealthy families in East Memphis, taking 2 buses each way to scrub floors and wash windows in homes that cost more than she would earn in a lifetime. She left before dawn and returned after dark, her hands perpetually raw from industrial cleaning solutions that no amount of lotion could truly heal. But every Friday evening, she would sit at the kitchen table and carefully divide her cash payment into envelopes labeled rent, utilities, food, and the one marked education that she protected more fiercely than any other. David's father, Richard Thompson, had worked at the FedEx Superhub since the company established its Memphis headquarters. The overnight shift paid slightly better than day work, so Richard slept in fragments, grabbing rest between his warehouse duties and his second job, doing maintenance work for apartment complexes in exchange for reduced rent. He was a man of few words but absolute consistency, showing up for every shift, every obligation, every moment his family needed him despite exhaustion that had carved permanent lines into his face by the time he turned 40. What set David apart from other children in his neighborhood was not intelligence, though he had plenty of that. It was not work ethic, because everyone around him worked harder than most people considered humanly possible. What distinguished David was his mother's absolute refusal to let circumstances define his future and her willingness to sacrifice everything to ensure he had opportunities. She had never imagined for herself. Gloria had noticed David's fascination with electronics when he was 7 years old. Watching him take apart a broken radio she had retrieved from a trash pile outside one of her clients' homes. Most parents would have scolded a child for creating more mess in an already crowded house. Gloria saw something different. She saw focused concentration, methodical problem-solving, and a hunger to understand how things worked that reminded her of her own father, a man who had fixed everything in their rural Tennessee community, despite never having formal training in anything. She began bringing home discarded electronics from the wealthy families she worked for, equipment they considered obsolete, but which represented treasure to a boy who had never owned anything new. Broken computers, outdated game consoles, malfunctioning televisions. David's corner of the bedroom he shared with 2 brothers became a laboratory of disassembled technology and meticulous reconstruction attempts. By the time he was 10, he was repairing neighbors' electronics for small amounts of cash that he carefully saved in a shoe box under his bed. The turning point came when David was 13 and a guidance counselor at his underfunded middle school mentioned a summer computer programming course offered at the public library. The course was free, but it required transportation to a branch library across town and took place during hours when Gloria normally worked. Most families in their situation would have dismissed it as impractical. Gloria quit one of her cleaning clients, accepting reduced income she could not afford to lose, so she could take David to that library every Tuesday and Thursday for 8 weeks. That summer course introduced David to programming languages that would eventually make him a fortune. But more importantly, it introduced him to Mr. Harold Jenkins, a retired IBM engineer who volunteered teaching the class, because he believed technology education should not be limited to children whose parents could afford private lessons. Mr. Jenkins recognized something in David that went beyond technical aptitude. He saw a young man with the discipline to work through complex problems and the creativity to imagine solutions that did not yet exist. Mr. Jenkins became an informal mentor, meeting David at the library weekly even after the summer course ended, providing books that David could never have afforded, explaining concepts that went far beyond the standard curriculum. When David was 15, Mr. Jenkins helped him apply for a scholarship program at a local community college that allowed high school students to take entry-level computer science courses. The program was competitive, designed for gifted students from underprivileged backgrounds, and David's acceptance represented validation that his abilities extended beyond his neighborhood's limited opportunities. The community college courses transformed David's understanding of what technology could accomplish and what role he might play in that transformation. While other teenagers were concerned with typical adolescent dramas, David spent evenings writing code, designing programs, and imagining systems that could solve real problems he observed in communities like his own. He saw how limited access to information kept people trapped in circumstances they might escape with better resources. He understood how inefficient systems wasted time that poor people could not afford to lose. His senior project at community college was a database management system designed to help small businesses track inventory more efficiently than the expensive software marketed to corporations. The project earned recognition at a regional technology fair where David met representatives from several universities offering full scholarships to students with exceptional technical skills and demonstrated financial need. The scholarship to Stanford represented an opportunity so far beyond anything his family had imagined that Gloria cried for 3 days. Terrified and proud in equal measure, Stanford brought David into contact with wealth and privilege that shocked him initially and motivated him permanently. His roommate freshman year was the son of a venture capitalist whose family owned 3 homes and considered a BMW an appropriate vehicle for a college student. The casual assumptions about resources, opportunities, and futures were alien to David, who had grown up calculating the cost of every meal and wearing clothes until they literally fell apart. But David did not respond to this exposure with resentment or intimidation. Instead, he studied how wealth operated, how connections created opportunities, how confidence opened doors that talent alone could not access. He learned to code switch between the formal English his mother had insisted he master and the technical jargon his professors expected. He developed the ability to be equally comfortable in venture capital pitch meetings and South Memphis family gatherings, translating between worlds that rarely communicated. His breakthrough came during his junior year when he developed an algorithm that dramatically improved data storage efficiency for cloud computing systems. The technology was elegant in its simplicity, solving a problem that major corporations had thrown millions of dollars at without success. David recognized immediately that he had created something valuable, but he lacked the business knowledge to capitalize on it. That recognition led him to take every entrepreneurship course Stanford offered, teaching himself the business side of technology with the same intensity he had brought to learning. Programming Thompson Technologies began in his dorm room senior year with 2 classmates who believed in David's vision for making enterprise-level data infrastructure accessible to smaller organizations. The initial funding came from competition winnings and small grants designed for student entrepreneurs. The real breakthrough came when Mr. Jenkins, his mentor from the library program, mortgaged his modest retirement home to provide David with $50,000 in seed capital, an act of faith that David would spend the rest of his life trying to repay. In ways that extended far beyond money, the company's growth was explosive once David's technology proved its value in real-world applications. Within 5 years, Thompson Technologies had secured contracts with major corporations, attracted significant venture capital investment, and established David as a rising figure in Silicon Valley's technology ecosystem. Within 10 years, the company had gone public at a valuation that made David a billionaire before his 35th birthday. But wealth had not changed David's fundamental understanding of how the world worked or how it treated people based on factors that had nothing to do with merit or character. He had experienced enough racism in professional settings to understand that success made you harder to dismiss, but did not prevent people from trying. He had been questioned about whether he was really the CEO in meetings where his white employees were assumed to be the executives. He had been stopped by security in buildings where his company rented office space, assumed to be a delivery person rather than the principal tenant. Those experiences had taught him valuable lessons about documentation and accountability. When discrimination occurred, David ensured there were witnesses, records, and consequences. He had successfully sued a commercial real estate company that tried to refuse his office lease application. He had filed complaints against banks that subjected his business to additional scrutiny, despite his company's strong financials. He had learned that silence in the face of discrimination was not dignity but complicity in systems that harmed everyone they touched. When Marcus was born, David had hoped that his son would grow up insulated from the indignities he had experienced. He provided Marcus with private tutors, enrolled him in elite schools, and surrounded him with opportunities that David had only imagined as possibilities during his own childhood. He taught his son about their family's history, about Gloria's sacrifices and Richard's consistency, about the importance of using privilege to create change, rather than simply enjoying its comforts. But he had also taught Marcus about the realities that wealth could not completely shield them from, about the importance of staying calm when confronted with prejudice, about documenting injustice so it could be challenged effectively. Those lessons had been abstract, until David watched surveillance footage showing his son being treated as suspicious, simply for existing in spaces where others decided he did not belong. The decision to expose Continental Airways' discrimination was not impulsive or emotional. It was the calculated application of everything David had learned about power, accountability, and systematic change. His mother had taught him the value of sacrifice for future generations. His father had demonstrated the importance of showing up consistently even when circumstances were difficult. Mr. Jenkins had shown him that mentorship could transform lives when it was offered generously to those who needed it most. Now David was applying those lessons to ensure that his son and countless other children would not have to navigate a world where their legitimacy was constantly questioned based on the color of their skin. The confrontation at Gate D28 was not just about Marcus's right to occupy a first-class seat. It was about David's determination to use every resource at his disposal to force institutions to live up to the values they claimed to embrace, but rarely demonstrated when tested by reality. Continental Airways had spent the past decade rebuilding its reputation from a regional carrier plagued by service complaints into a premium transcontinental airline that competed directly with industry giants. The transformation had been driven by CEO Jennifer Hartman, a former Boeing executive who understood that modern airlines competed not just on price and routes, but on customer experience and brand perception. Under her leadership, Continental had invested heavily in newer aircraft, upgraded cabin interiors and marketing campaigns emphasizing their commitment to treating every passenger with dignity and respect. The company's Diversity and Inclusion Initiative had launched 3 years earlier with considerable fanfare. Press releases announced partnerships with historically black colleges and universities to recruit flight attendants and pilots. Training programs promised to address unconscious bias and create welcoming environments for passengers from all backgrounds. Annual reports featured statistics about workforce diversity and customer satisfaction scores broken down by demographic categories. Jennifer Hartman herself had given speeches at aviation industry conferences about the business case for inclusive practices, arguing that airlines capturing diverse markets would dominate the industry's future. What those glossy reports and inspiring speeches did not reveal was the gap between corporate policy and frontline reality. The diversity training that looked comprehensive on paper consisted of a single 4-hour session that most employees found tedious and dismissible. The complaint resolution process that promised swift action on discrimination allegations actually funneled most complaints into a bureaucratic maze where they were reviewed, categorized, and frequently dismissed as misunderstandings rather than policy violations. Catherine Walsh had completed her diversity training 3 years earlier, sitting through presentations about respecting cultural differences and avoiding stereotypical assumptions. She had signed acknowledgement forms confirming she understood Continental's zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. She had even participated in role-playing exercises, where she practiced responding appropriately to passengers from various backgrounds. None of that training had fundamentally changed how she assessed passengers in real-world situations where corporate oversight was minimal and her own judgment carried the weight of operational authority. The institutional culture that enabled Catherine's behavior extended far beyond individual bias. Continental's performance evaluation system for flight attendants emphasized metrics like on-time departures, cabin cleanliness scores, and passenger complaint resolution. What the system did not effectively measure was whether employees treated all passengers equally or whether certain passengers received additional scrutiny based on demographic characteristics. Flight attendants who maintained smooth operations and avoided escalated conflicts received positive reviews regardless of whether their conflict avoidance came at the expense of passengers who were quietly discriminated against. Brian Patterson, the gate agent working Flight 2847, represented another dimension of institutional failure. He had witnessed Catherine's discriminatory treatment of passengers on multiple previous occasions over their 5 years working together. He had seen her question the validity of tickets held by passengers of color while waving through white passengers with identical documentation. He had heard her make comments in crew areas about certain passengers not belonging in premium cabins. He had even received complaints from passengers about her behavior and had dutifully filed them through Continental's official channels. Those complaints had gone nowhere. Brian's supervisor, regional manager Kevin Douglas, reviewed discrimination allegations with an eye toward protecting the company from liability rather than addressing underlying problems. When Brian flagged Catherine's pattern of behavior, Kevin had responded that Continental could not discipline employees based on judgment calls made in good faith during operational situations. The complaints were documented in personnel files that no one with authority to create change ever meaningfully reviewed. Kevin Douglas himself operated within a management structure that rewarded efficiency and punished disruption. His performance evaluations focused on gate operations metrics, aircraft turnaround times, and customer service scores aggregated at the regional level. Individual discrimination complaints represented potential problems that could damage his metrics if they escalated to formal investigations or media attention. His incentive was to resolve complaints quietly, preferably by convincing complainants that misunderstandings had occurred rather than acknowledging systematic failures that might require expensive remediation. The system's protection of problematic employees extended to how Continental handled external complaints. When passengers filed discrimination allegations with the Department of Transportation or state civil rights agencies, Continental's legal team deployed strategies designed to minimize liability rather than address root causes. They argued that individual employees had made reasonable judgment calls based on operational concerns. They produced employee training records to demonstrate corporate commitment to anti-discrimination policies. They offered settlement agreements that included non-disclosure provisions preventing complainants from discussing their experiences publicly. This approach had been remarkably effective at containing potential scandals. Over the past 5 years, Continental had settled 17 discrimination complaints involving flight attendants or gate agents for amounts ranging from $5,000 to $50,000. Each settlement included confidentiality clauses that prevented the complainants from warning other passengers about their experiences. The settlements were processed through Continental's risk management budget rather than charged to operational departments, creating no direct incentive for frontline managers to address discriminatory behavior before it resulted in formal complaints. Catherine Walsh had been the subject of 4 of those settled complaints, a fact that appeared in her personnel file but had never resulted in meaningful disciplinary action. After each settlement, she received remedial training that consisted of reviewing Continental's anti-discrimination policy and signing another acknowledgement form. She returned to her regular duties with her seniority intact, her flight assignments unchanged, and her authority over passenger interactions undiminished. The message the system sent was clear. Discrimination might cost the company money, but it would not cost employees their careers as long as they were otherwise competent at operational tasks. The technology systems that airlines relied on for passenger management contained their own institutional biases. Continental's reservation software included fields for special service requests, unaccompanied minor designations, and passenger status levels. But it had no effective mechanism for flagging when employees subjected certain passengers to disproportionate scrutiny. The system tracked which employees processed which transactions, but that data was almost never analyzed to identify patterns suggesting discriminatory behavior. Gate agents like Brian could see individual complaints in passenger records, but they had no visibility into patterns across multiple flights that might reveal systematic problems. Airport security systems operated in parallel with airline operations, creating additional layers where bias could operate unchecked. Transportation Security Administration personnel received their own training on avoiding profiling and treating all passengers equally. But TSA and airline staff often developed informal working relationships where assumptions about suspicious passengers were shared through casual conversations rather than official channels. If a gate agent like Catherine expressed concerns about a passenger to nearby TSA officers, those concerns might result in additional screening that appeared to be random but actually reflected the gate agent's initial bias. The premium cabin environment where Marcus was supposed to sit created its own dynamics of assumption and exclusion. First-class passengers on Continental flights received elevated service that included priority boarding, complimentary meals, and extra attention from flight attendants. But those premium experiences came with unspoken expectations about who belonged in those spaces. Flight attendants working first-class cabins developed mental models of what premium passengers looked like, how they dressed, how they behaved. When passengers did not match those models, flight attendants sometimes questioned their presence rather than examining their own assumptions. Continental's first-class cabin on transcontinental routes attracted a particular demographic: business travelers expensing premium tickets to corporate accounts, wealthy leisure travelers for whom cost was not a primary concern, and passengers using miles or upgrades earned through frequent travel. The cabin was overwhelmingly white, male, and middle-aged. When passengers who did not fit that profile appeared in first class, they sometimes faced questions about whether they were in the correct seat, whether they understood the cabin's expectations, whether they might be more comfortable elsewhere on the aircraft. The financial incentives throughout the aviation industry reinforced rather than challenged these patterns. Airlines made substantial profits from premium cabin tickets, and they marketed those spaces as exclusive experiences worthy of higher prices. The exclusivity was supposed to come from better seats, better service, and better amenities. But for employees like Catherine, who controlled access to those spaces, exclusivity sometimes got confused with exclusion of passengers who did not match her preconceptions about who deserved premium experiences. Training programs designed to address these issues typically failed because they treated discrimination as an individual, moral failing rather than a systematic institutional problem. Employees attended sessions where they learned about unconscious bias and practiced appropriate language for customer interactions. Then they returned to work environments where discriminatory decisions were rarely challenged as long as they did not generate formal complaints. The gap between what employees were taught in training and what they experienced as acceptable behavior in actual operations meant that training became a compliance exercise rather than a catalyst for meaningful change. The most insidious aspect of Continental's institutional failures was how they made discrimination seem reasonable to the people perpetrating it. Catherine genuinely believed she was protecting her flight and her passengers by questioning Marcus's presence in first class. She had convinced herself that her judgment was based on operational concerns about ticket validity rather than racial bias. The system had never forced her to confront how her supposedly neutral judgment consistently targeted passengers of color while giving white passengers the benefit of the doubt. Without that confrontation, she remained certain that her actions were appropriate, exercises of professional authority rather than violations of both company policy and federal anti-discrimination law. The network of institutional failure extended beyond Continental to encompass industry-wide practices that prioritized operational efficiency over passenger dignity. Airlines shared personnel across code-share agreements, meaning that employees who had discrimination complaints at one carrier could move to another without those complaints following them in any meaningful way. Industry associations established best practices for customer service but had no enforcement mechanisms for ensuring members actually implemented those practices. Regulatory agencies like the Federal Aviation Administration focused on safety compliance rather than civil rights enforcement, creating gaps in oversight that allowed discriminatory practices to flourish. What Catherine Walsh did not understand, as she stood at gate D28, insisting that Marcus did not belong in first class, was that she was not just exercising personal bias. She was the visible manifestation of an entire system that had been built to protect employees like her from accountability while allowing corporations to maintain plausible deniability about institutional discrimination. That system had successfully contained complaints, settled lawsuits, and preserved reputations for years. It was about encountering someone who had the resources to expose its failures and the determination to ensure that exposure resulted in fundamental change rather than another quietly settled complaint. Catherine Walsh had reached the point where backing down felt impossible without undermining everything she believed about her professional judgment and authority. She returned to where Marcus stood, her expression now set in the rigid determination of someone who had convinced herself that principle rather than prejudice guided her actions. "I've made my decision," Catherine announced loudly enough that passengers throughout the gate area could hear clearly. "This young man will not be boarding in first class. We're relocating him to an economy seat for the safety and comfort of all passengers." Marcus felt his heart pounding, but kept his face carefully neutral. He had promised his father he would remain calm regardless of what happened, trusting that documentation and witnesses would provide the accountability that immediate confrontation could not. But the public humiliation of being removed from his legitimate seat assignment in front of dozens of strangers was testing the limits of his 12-year-old composure. "Ma'am, I need to speak with a supervisor," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear and anger churning in his chest. "My ticket is valid, and I have every right to board this aircraft in my assigned seat." The request for a supervisor seemed to infuriate Catherine further, as if Marcus's refusal to accept her judgment represented an intolerable challenge to her authority. She turned to Brian Patterson with barely contained irritation. "Brian, call airport security. We have an uncooperative minor refusing to follow crew instructions. I want him removed from this gate area immediately." The escalation to security shocked even passengers who had been trying to ignore the confrontation. A businesswoman named Patricia Mendez, who had been watching the interaction with growing discomfort, stepped forward from her position in the boarding line. "Excuse me, but this seems completely unnecessary," Patricia said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in professional settings. "That young man has been completely polite and cooperative. He's done nothing that warrants calling security." Catherine rounded on Patricia with undisguised hostility. "Ma'am, this is an operational decision made by the flight crew. Passengers do not get to override crew authority regarding safety and security matters. Please return to your boarding position or I'll have you removed." From the flight as well, the threat to remove a passenger who had simply spoken up in defense of obvious injustice revealed how far Catherine had departed from reasonable professional judgment. Several other passengers began voicing objections, creating a groundswell of dissent that made Catherine's isolation increasingly apparent. Brian Patterson found himself in an impossible position. His computer screen clearly showed that Marcus's ticket was legitimate, paid in full, and properly documented. Every passenger complaint procedure he had been trained to follow indicated that Catherine was wrong. But challenging a senior flight attendant in front of passengers felt like professional suicide, given Continental's culture of protecting seniority over correctness. "Catherine, maybe we should call Kevin Douglas before involving security," Brian suggested quietly, referencing their regional manager in a last attempt to de-escalate before the situation became irreversible. "I don't need Kevin's permission to maintain order at my gate," Catherine snapped. "Call security now, or I'll report you for failure to support crew authority." The ultimatum forced Brian's hand. He picked up the phone and requested airport security to gate D28, his voice reflecting the resignation of someone who knew he was participating in something wrong, but felt powerless to prevent it. Marcus watched the security call happen with a strange sense of detachment. His father had prepared him for exactly this possibility, explaining that sometimes injustice needed to be documented fully before it could be challenged effectively. He pulled out his phone and opened the voice recording app, holding it openly so everyone could see he was documenting what was happening. The visible recording seemed to panic Catherine in a way that passenger objections had not. "Put that phone away immediately," she demanded, reaching toward Marcus as if to confiscate the device. Patricia Mendez stepped between Catherine and Marcus, her body language protective. "Don't you dare touch that child. He has every right to record this interaction, and frankly, I'm recording it too." She held up her own phone, as did at least 8 other passengers who had decided that what they were witnessing needed documentation. The gate area had transformed into an impromptu surveillance operation, with multiple angles capturing every word and action for posterity and potential legal proceedings. Airport security arrived within minutes. Officers Raymond Jackson and Nicole Freeman, both veterans who had responded to countless gate disputes and could usually assess situations accurately within seconds of arrival. What they found at gate D28 did not match the urgent tone of the security call they had received. Officer Jackson approached the group with practiced calm. "What seems to be the problem here?" Catherine launched into an explanation that revealed more about her assumptions than the actual situation. "This minor has a suspicious ticket, is refusing to follow crew instructions, and is being disruptive. Multiple passengers are interfering with crew authority. I need them removed so we can board this flight safely." Officer Freeman was already scanning the crowd of passengers, noting their body language and the unusual number of phones recording the interaction. In her experience, actual security threats did not generate this kind of organized passenger documentation. This looked like something else entirely. "Son, can I see your identification and boarding pass?" Officer Freeman asked Marcus gently, her tone professional but not accusatory. Marcus handed over his documents with steady hands, his voice clear when he explained. "My name is Marcus Thompson. My father purchased this first-class ticket 3 weeks ago using his corporate account. I have all confirmation numbers and proper identification. I've been cooperative throughout this process. The flight attendant has refused to allow me to board, based solely on her visual assessment of my appearance. The explanation was articulate beyond what most 12-year-olds could deliver under stress, which made Officer Freeman look more carefully at the documentation Marcus provided. What she saw made her pause. A legitimate ticket, proper identification, and confirmation numbers that would be easy to verify through Continental systems. "Ma'am, this documentation appears completely legitimate," Officer Freeman said to Catherine. "What specifically makes you believe there's a problem with this passenger's ticket?" Catherine's response revealed the bankruptcy of her position. "I've been doing this job for 18 years. I know when something doesn't add up. That ticket is too expensive for someone like him." The phrase "someone like him" hung in the air with all its ugly implications. Officer Jackson, who was black himself, recognized instantly what was happening. He had witnessed enough discrimination in his security work to identify it, even when people tried to disguise prejudice as professional judgment. Officer Freeman's phone buzzed with an incoming call from her supervisor, which was unusual during a routine gate response. She stepped away to answer it, and what she heard made her expression shift from professional neutrality to something approaching concern. When she returned, her entire demeanor had changed. She looked at Marcus with new recognition, then at Catherine with something resembling pity. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from this passenger immediately," Officer Freeman said to Catherine, her voice now carrying unmistakable authority. "This is not a security situation. This is a discrimination complaint that will be handled through appropriate channels." Catherine's face flushed with defensive anger. "I am the senior flight attendant on this aircraft, and I have final authority over passenger boarding. You need to remove this passenger as I requested." Officer Freeman shook her head slowly. "That's not going to happen. In fact, I need to inform you that you're being relieved of duty pending an investigation. Your supervisor has been notified and is en route to this location." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. "Relieved of duty for what?" "I was doing my job protecting this flight from a suspicious situation. Officer Jackson had been quietly reviewing something on his own phone, and when he looked up, his expression suggested he had just accessed information that explained everything about why this situation had escalated so quickly through official channels." "Do you know who this child's father is?" Officer Jackson asked Catherine, his voice neutral but his eyes sharp. Catherine's confusion was genuine. "What does that have to do with anything? I don't care who his father is. That doesn't change the fact that this ticket is suspicious. His father is David Thompson," Officer Jackson said slowly, watching Catherine's face for recognition. "Thompson Technologies. Net worth approximately $12 billion. One of the 50 wealthiest people in America. And based on the call my supervisor just received, he's been watching every moment of this interaction through multiple channels, and his legal team is already preparing comprehensive discrimination complaints with federal regulators." The color drained from Catherine's face as the magnitude of her mistake became suddenly devastatingly clear. Her legs seemed to weaken, and she reached for the gate desk to steady herself. Marcus watched her realization with the same careful neutrality he had maintained throughout the confrontation. He felt no satisfaction in her distress, only a weary recognition that this was exactly what his father had predicted would happen when institutions were forced to confront discrimination they normally found ways to excuse or ignore. Patricia Mendez stepped forward, her voice carrying throughout the now silent gate area. "I want to go on record as a witness. I watched this entire interaction from the beginning. That flight attendant discriminated against this child based solely on his race. She questioned his legitimate ticket, threatened him with removal, and called security when he simply asked to speak with a supervisor. Her behavior was appalling, and Continental Airways should be held fully accountable." 7 other passengers immediately echoed Patricia's statement, creating a chorus of witness testimony that would make any attempt by Continental to dismiss the incident as a misunderstanding legally untenable. Kevin Douglas, The regional manager arrived at the gate looking harried and increasingly panicked as he grasped the scope of the crisis unfolding. Behind him came a woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as Rachel Blackwood, Continental Airways chief legal counsel, who had apparently been summoned urgently from the Airline's Atlanta headquarters. Rachel's presence signaled that Continental's leadership understood this was not a routine passenger complaint that could be resolved with apologies and travel vouchers. She approached Marcus with professional courtesy that contrasted sharply with Catherine's treatment. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Rachel Blackwood from Continental Airways. I want to apologize on behalf of our company for how you've been treated today. We take discrimination allegations extremely seriously, and I assure you this matter will be investigated thoroughly and appropriate action will be taken." Marcus looked at her steadily. "My father is waiting for me in Los Angeles. I'd like to board my flight now and take the seat I was assigned. Everything else can be addressed through proper channels." The simple request emphasized how reasonable Marcus had been throughout the entire confrontation and how unreasonable Catherine's response had become. Rachel nodded immediately. "Of course. Officer Freeman, would you please escort Mr. Thompson to the aircraft and ensure he's seated comfortably? Catherine, you're suspended, pending investigation. Kevin, we need to discuss crisis management protocols immediately." As Marcus walked down the jet bridge, escorted by Officer Freeman, he turned on his phone and sent a brief text to his father. "Boarding now. Everything happened exactly like you said it would." In Los Angeles, David Thompson read the message and allowed himself a grim smile. The documentation phase was complete. Now comes accountability. Within 40 minutes of Marcus boarding Flight 2847, David Thompson's legal team had filed formal complaints with 3 separate federal agencies. The documentation was comprehensive and devastating. 27 minutes of video footage from multiple passenger phones, airport security camera recordings showing the entire confrontation from 4 different angles, and written witness statements from 11 passengers who had observed Catherine Walsh's discriminatory behavior from start to finish. The complaint, filed with the Department of Transportation's Aviation Consumer Protection Division, detailed specific violations of federal regulations prohibiting discrimination in air travel. David's attorneys had cross-referenced Catherine's treatment of Marcus against Continental Airways' own published policies, demonstrating clear gaps between corporate commitments and actual employee behavior. The filing included financial analysis showing that Continental had settled 17 previous discrimination complaints over 5 years, suggesting systematic rather than isolated failures. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division received a parallel complaint alleging violations of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, specifically provisions prohibiting discrimination in public accommodations. This filing positioned Marcus's experience within the broader context of racial discrimination in transportation, citing precedents from the civil rights movement and connecting historical patterns of exclusion to contemporary manifestations in airline operations. The legal team had prepared expert testimony from civil rights historians and sociologists who could speak to how Catherine's assumptions about Marcus reflected deeply embedded structural racism. Continental Airways corporate headquarters in Houston received simultaneous notification of the complaints along with a legal preservation letter demanding that the airline retain all relevant documents, communications, and personnel records related to Catherine Walsh, Gate D28 operations, and discrimination complaint procedures. The preservation letter made clear that failure to maintain these records would result in additional legal sanctions for evidence destruction. Jennifer Hartman, Continental's CEO, was in a board meeting when her assistant interrupted with news that required immediate attention. Within minutes, she was in an emergency conference call with Rachel Blackwood, the chief legal counsel, Kevin Douglas, the regional manager, and Harrison Mitchell, the company's chief communications officer. The recordings that David Thompson's team had provided to media outlets were already circulating on social media, generating millions of views and overwhelmingly negative reactions. The video that gained the most traction showed Catherine's statement about Marcus's ticket being too expensive for someone like him, with her emphasis on those final words making her discriminatory intent unmistakable. News outlets were already requesting comments from Continental about their employment practices and discrimination policies. Civil rights organizations were issuing statements demanding accountability and systematic reforms. Social media influencers with millions of followers were sharing the footage with commentary about how wealth could not protect black children from routine humiliation. Harrison Mitchell understood immediately that standard corporate crisis management strategies would be insufficient for this situation. Continental could not issue vague statements about taking allegations seriously while conducting internal investigations that would quietly conclude with minor disciplinary actions and no admission of wrongdoing. The documentation was too comprehensive, the legal exposure too severe, and the public attention too intense for business-as-usual damage control. We need to get ahead of this immediately. Harrison told the emergency leadership team, terminate Catherine Walsh within the hour. Issue a public apology that acknowledges specific failures rather than generic regret. Announce an independent external audit of our discrimination complaint procedures, and prepare for the likelihood that this will cost us tens of millions in legal settlements and reputation recovery. Jennifer Hartman was already calculating the broader implications. Continental's stock price would likely drop when markets opened the following morning. Partnership agreements with corporate clients might be reviewed or cancelled. Regulatory scrutiny would intensify across all operational areas. The company's carefully cultivated brand identity as an inclusive premium carrier was disintegrating in real time. Catherine Walsh sat in Kevin Douglas's office, still processing the catastrophic reversal of her situation. 30 minutes earlier, she had been confident in her authority and judgment. Now she was suspended, facing termination, and watching her 18-year aviation career collapse. Her union representative had arrived and was already explaining that Continental's discrimination policy provided limited protection for employees whose actions were thoroughly documented and publicly exposed. Kevin Douglas found himself under equal scrutiny as investigators began reviewing his handling of previous complaints against Catherine. The 4 settled discrimination cases that had never resulted in meaningful discipline would now be examined as evidence of management failures that enabled Catherine's continued problematic behavior. His own employment was suddenly precarious as Continental's leadership looked for people to hold accountable for systematic oversights. Brian Patterson was being interviewed by Continental's internal investigation team, asked to detail every incident of discriminatory behavior he had witnessed from Catherine over their 5 years working together. His previous complaints to Kevin, which had been dismissed or minimized, were now being treated as critical evidence that management had been warned about Catherine's patterns, but failed to act appropriately. Brian felt a complicated mix of vindication and guilt, knowing his testimony would contribute to Catherine's termination. While wondering whether he could have done more to prevent Marcus's humiliation, passengers who had witnessed the confrontation were discovering that their documentation had become part of a significant civil rights case. Patricia Mendez received calls from news outlets requesting interviews about what she had observed. Several other passengers found their phone footage being shared across social media platforms with millions of views. Some embraced the attention as an opportunity to speak about discrimination they had witnessed throughout their lives. Others felt uncomfortable with their sudden visibility, but recognized their testimony was necessary for accountability. Marcus landed at Los Angeles International Airport 5 hours after the confrontation began, emotionally exhausted but physically safe. David Thompson met him at the gate with the embrace that communicated relief, pride, and protective fury in equal measure. Father and son walked through the terminal together, David's hand on Marcus's shoulder, both understanding that the boy's experience would become a public catalyst for change he had not chosen but would help create. The legal strategy David had developed extended beyond Continental Airways to target systematic aviation industry practices. His attorneys filed complaints against the International Air Transport Association for failing to enforce anti-discrimination standards among member airlines. They petitioned the Federal Aviation Administration to establish mandatory reporting requirements for discrimination incidents similar to safety reporting protocols. They prepared class action lawsuit paperwork on behalf of all passengers who had experienced discrimination. On continental flights over the past decade, media coverage intensified as investigative journalists began uncovering the 17 previously settled discrimination complaints that Continental had kept confidential. Reporters contacted former passengers who had accepted settlements in exchange for non-disclosure agreements, many of whom were now willing to speak publicly despite potential legal consequences. A pattern emerged showing that Continental had spent over $800,000 settling complaints rather than investing in training and accountability systems that might prevent future incidents. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People announced an investigation into discrimination practices across the entire commercial aviation industry, using Marcus's experience as the launching point for broader examination of how airlines treated passengers of color. Other civil rights organizations joined the effort, creating coordinated pressure that prevented Continental from framing this as an isolated incident involving one problematic employee. Continental's board of directors convened an emergency meeting to address the crisis and determine how aggressively the company should fight David Thompson's legal actions versus seeking settlement. Some board members argued for vigorous legal defense, claiming that one employee's misconduct should not expose the company to unlimited liability. Others recognized that fighting would generate more negative publicity and potentially reveal additional problematic practices that had not yet been exposed. Jennifer Hartman made the decision that would define her legacy as CEO. Continental would not fight. They would accept responsibility, implement comprehensive reforms, and work towards settlement terms that prioritize systematic change over minimizing financial exposure. The decision was controversial among board members focused on shareholder value, but Jennifer understood that Continental's long-term viability required rebuilding trust that legal battles would only further erode. Within 72 hours of Marcus's experience at Gate D28, Catherine Walsh had been terminated. Kevin Douglas had been demoted and reassigned, and Continental Airways had announced a comprehensive overhaul of discrimination complaint procedures. The company committed to hiring an independent monitor who would review all discrimination allegations and report findings directly to the board of directors, rather than through operational management chains that had previously buried complaints. The financial costs were staggering but necessary. Continental allocated $12 million for enhanced discrimination training delivered by external civil rights organizations rather than internal human resources staff. They established a victim compensation fund of $20 million for passengers who had experienced discrimination on Continental flights and been pressured into confidential settlements. They committed to diversifying their flight attendant and management ranks, setting specific hiring targets, and making senior executives' compensation partially dependent on achieving those diversity goals. David Thompson had achieved something rare in corporate accountability battles, forcing institutional change that extended beyond individual punishment to address systematic failures. Marcus's humiliation had been transformed into precedent that would protect countless future passengers from similar treatment. The documentation strategy that had seemed calculated and cold in planning became retrospectively justified by the comprehensive reforms it generated. But David also understood that legal victories and corporate policy changes did not erase the emotional impact of discrimination on his son. Marcus had experienced public humiliation that no settlement could undo. He had learned that his legitimacy would be questioned in spaces where he had every right to exist. Those lessons were valuable in preparing him for realities he would continue facing, but they came at a cost that wealth and legal success could not fully compensate for. 18 months after the confrontation at Gate D28, Marcus Thompson stood before a congressional subcommittee examining discrimination in commercial transportation. At 13, he had become an unexpected voice in national conversations about how institutions treated children of color. His testimony sought by lawmakers crafting legislation to strengthen civil rights protections across interstate commerce. The hearing room was packed with journalists, civil rights advocates, and airline industry representatives watching to see how a teenager would handle questioning from senators whose political careers had been built on far more years than Marcus had been alive. Chairman Senator Michael Reynolds opened the session by acknowledging the unusual nature of inviting such a young witness, but emphasizing that Marcus's experience had exposed systematic failures that affected millions of travelers annually. Marcus spoke clearly and without notes, describing not just his own experience, but patterns he had learned about through conversations with other young people who had faced similar treatment. He explained how discrimination taught children that their legitimacy was always questionable, how it created psychological costs that no amount of compensation could fully address, and how institutional failures to address bias perpetuated harm across generations. When Senator Julia Martinez from Texas asked whether Continental Airways reforms had been sufficient, Marcus's response demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of institutional change. The company has made important policy changes, but policies only matter if they change actual behavior. Real accountability means measuring whether passengers of color stop experiencing disproportionate scrutiny, not just whether airlines have impressive-sounding programs that look good in annual reports. The testimony was covered extensively by national media, with clips circulating across platforms and generating discussions about how seriously institutions took discrimination when it affected children. Marcus's composure and articulate analysis challenged assumptions about young people's capacity to understand complex social issues, while his specific policy recommendations influenced the legislation that eventually emerged from the subcommittee's work. David Thompson watched the hearing from the gallery, experiencing the complicated emotions of a father who had deliberately exposed his son to public scrutiny for purposes that extended beyond their family's immediate interests. The strategy had generated exactly the accountability and reform he had sought, but it had also thrust Marcus into a level of visibility that limited his ability to simply be a teenager without every action being interpreted through the lens of his role in a civil rights case. The settlement Continental Airways reached with the Thompson family had remained confidential in its financial terms, but the institutional reforms it mandated had become public knowledge through the company's required transparency reporting. Continental now published quarterly discrimination statistics showing complaint volumes, investigation outcomes, and disciplinary actions taken against employees. The data revealed troubling patterns in the first quarters after implementation, but showed steady improvement as new training protocols and accountability systems took effect. Dr. Alicia Rodriguez, Continental's chief equity officer, had transformed the position from a symbolic gesture into a genuinely powerful oversight role. Her direct reporting relationship to the board of directors, combined with authority to modify any company policies she deemed discriminatory, gave her leverage that typical diversity officers never possessed. Her comprehensive audits had exposed uncomfortable truths about how Continental's operations affected different passenger demographics. forcing executives to confront data they had previously been able to ignore or rationalize. The Passenger Advocacy Office Continental processed over 3,000 complaints in its first year, a volume that shocked executives who had believed discrimination was rare in their operations. The complaints revealed patterns across multiple airports and route networks, demonstrating that Catherine Walsh's behavior had been symptomatic of much broader cultural problems. Gate agents routinely subjected passengers of color to additional documentation scrutiny. Flight attendants made seat assignment changes that disproportionately relocated non-white passengers from premium cabins. Customer service representatives resolved complaints less favorably for passengers from marginalized communities. The transparency requirements meant these patterns became public knowledge rather than internal data that companies could bury. Advocacy organizations analyzed the quarterly reports, identifying airports and routes where discrimination complaints were highest and pressuring Continental to implement targeted interventions. The public scrutiny created accountability that internal oversight alone had never achieved, forcing Continental to address problems that would have previously been dismissed as isolated incidents or individual employee failings. Other airlines responded to Continental's crisis by conducting their own internal audits, most discovering similar patterns they had not previously acknowledged or measured. American Airlines identified disparities in how security screening was applied across demographic groups at their major hubs. Delta discovered that their customer service algorithms prioritized complaint resolution for passengers with certain purchasing patterns in ways that created racial disparities. United found that their unaccompanied minor protocols subjected children of color to additional verification requirements that white children rarely experienced. The industry-wide reckoning forced airlines to invest in reforms they had resisted when civil rights organizations had requested them through normal advocacy channels. The combination of legal liability, regulatory pressure, and reputation damage created incentives that abstract appeals to fairness had never generated. Airlines hired external monitors, implemented bias training with actual accountability measures, and established transparent reporting systems that made discrimination visible rather than easily hidden. The Federal Aviation Administration's expanded oversight mandate included discrimination monitoring requirements that fundamentally changed how airlines approached civil rights compliance. The agency established reporting standards comparable to safety incident requirements, forcing airlines to document and analyze patterns rather than treating each complaint as an isolated event. Financial penalties for companies showing systematic discrimination created concrete costs for failures that had previously been manageable through quiet settlements and confidentiality agreements. The Department of Transportation launched investigation findings that revealed discrimination extended throughout commercial transportation. Bus companies subjected passengers of color to additional questioning about ticket legitimacy. Train services applied different standards when enforcing behavior policies depending on passenger demographics. Ride-sharing platforms used algorithms that created disparate impacts across racial groups. The comprehensive documentation forced transportation providers to confront practices they had long defended as operationally necessary but which actually reflected institutional bias. Catherine Walsh's termination became a reference point in employment law courses examining when companies could discipline workers for conduct outside explicit policy violations. Her case illustrated how institutional protection of problematic employees created liability that eventually exceeded any value those employees provided. Legal scholars analyzed how Continental's previous settlement of complaints against Catherine had established company knowledge of her discriminatory patterns, making their continued employment of her evidence of institutional tolerance for bias rather than mere failure to detect individual misconduct. Catherine herself had given only one extended interview since her termination. speaking with a journalist, writing a comprehensive examination of the case's impact. She expressed regret for her treatment of Marcus, while also claiming she had been made a scapegoat for industry-wide practices. I was doing what I had been trained to do, which was to use my judgment about passenger behavior and ticket irregularities, Catherine told the interviewer. The fact that my judgment reflected biases I didn't recognize doesn't make me uniquely terrible. It makes me typical of how this industry operated before one family had the resources to force accountability. The statement was probably accurate as a description of industry norms, but it did not absolve Catherine of responsibility for her actions or diminish the harm she had caused. Her inability to recognize how her assumptions had shaped her treatment of Marcus, even in retrospect, suggested the depth of bias that required institutional intervention rather than relying on individual self-awareness. Patricia Mendez, the businesswoman who had intervened during the confrontation, had become an advocate for bystander training in professional environments. She conducted workshops teaching people how to document discrimination when witnessing it, how to support targets of bias without speaking over them, and how to report incidents effectively through appropriate channels. Her organization, which she had founded using her own resources after Marcus's case, inspired her to more active advocacy, trained thousands of employees across multiple industries in intervention techniques that balanced supporting victims with avoiding actions that could escalate dangerous situations. Marcus's school had integrated his experience into their curriculum in ways that created genuine learning rather than superficial acknowledgement of diversity issues. Students studied the case in history classes examining contemporary civil rights struggles, in ethics courses exploring institutional accountability, and in writing classes analyzing how personal narrative could drive social change. The discussions were sometimes difficult, particularly when they forced students to examine their own privileges and assumptions. But they created awareness that would shape how those students understood their responsibilities as they moved into positions of influence. Thompson Technology's Equity Foundation had provided scholarships and technology education access to over 5,000 students in its first 18 months of operation. The program deliberately focused on communities where schools lacked resources for comprehensive computer science education, creating pathways into technology careers for young people who might otherwise never have considered those possibilities. Program participants received not just technical training but mentorship from technology professionals who could help them navigate industries where they might be among few people who looked like them. Marcus worked with the Foundation's programs, mentoring younger students and sharing his journey with coding. He found purpose in using his visibility to create opportunities for others, transforming his experience from purely a source of pain into something that generated positive change. His conversations with students from backgrounds similar to his father's childhood gave him perspective on his own advantages while reinforcing his understanding of why confronting discrimination mattered for everyone it affected. The legal precedents established through Thompson family litigation influenced discrimination cases across multiple industries. Courts cited the case when evaluating institutional liability for employee misconduct, establishing higher standards for what companies needed to do to demonstrate genuine commitment to anti-discrimination policies. The precedents made it harder for organizations to avoid accountability by claiming individual employees had acted against company values when evidence showed patterns of tolerating or protecting discriminatory behavior. Marcus wrote an essay for a national youth publication reflecting on what the experience had taught him. The piece was thoughtful and mature, acknowledging both the pain of discrimination and his privilege in having resources to fight back. He wrote about responsibility, about how advantages came with obligations to use them for purposes beyond personal benefit. "I wish that day had never happened," Marcus wrote. I wish I could travel without wondering if people are judging me before they know anything about me. But that day also taught me that ignoring injustice doesn't make it disappear. My father gave me tools to demand accountability. Now I have to figure out how to use those tools, not just for myself, but for people without billionaire fathers protecting them. David Thompson read the essay recognizing his son had learned the most important lesson, that privilege meant nothing if hoarded rather than used to challenge systems harming people without similar advantages. Marcus understood what his grandmother Gloria had taught David, that achievement was not an end point, but a starting point for harder work of creating a world where everyone could pursue their potential without being diminished by prejudice. The confrontation at Gate D28 had been a moment of injustice that could have been buried like countless similar incidents. Instead, it became a catalyst for change, rippling through industries and institutions in ways no one present could have anticipated. One flight attendant's assumptions colliding with documentation and determination had created precedents protecting countless others from similar treatment, proving that accountability was possible when people refused to accept injustice as simply how things were and always would be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.